Welcome to Cities at Tufts. This is our colloquium, our Wednesday colloquium, and along with our partners Shareable and the Cresley Foundation and the Bar Foundation. I'm Professor Julian Adjuman, and together with my research assistants, Caitlin McLennan and Perry Scheinbaum, we organise Cities at Tufts as a cross-disciplinary academic initiative which recognises Tufts University as a leader in urban studies, urban planning and sustainability issues. We'd like to acknowledge that Tufts University's Medford campus is located on colonised Wampanoag and Massachusetts traditional territory. Today, we're really delighted to welcome Dr. Stacey Sutton. Stacey is an associate professor in the Department of Urban Planning and Policy, and she's director of the Applied Research and Strategic Partnerships at the University of Illinois Chicago's Social Justice Initiative. That's a very long title. She's the recipient of the prestigious 2021 Ed Blakely Award given by the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning and the Planners of Colour Interest Group in recognition of a scholar's dedication to the cause of social justice, particularly for communities of colour. Stacey's research and teaching are broadly within the area of community economic development, with a central focus on economic democracy and worker-owned cooperatives, the solidarity economy movement, gentrification and dispossession, neighbourhood small business dynamics, and the disparate effects of place-based city policymaking. A framework for research and community engagement fascinates me, and it entails advancing cooperative cities and the solidarity economy and critiquing the notion of punitive cities. In Stacey's latest research project, titled Real Black Utopias, she explores infrastructures, ideologies, and practices of Black-led cooperatives and solidarity economy ecosystems. Stacey's talk today, appropriately, is Punitive and Cooperative Cities. Stacey, a Zoom-tastic welcome to the Cities at Tufts colloquium. As usual, microphones off, please, and video off, and send questions through the chat function. Stacey will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open to questions. Stacey, welcome to Tufts.
Thank you so much, Julian. And thank the Tufts community. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm also thrilled that I'm not in Boston in the snow, the Medford area in snow, although I am in Chicago. So, you know, 6 of one, half dozen of another. I'm going to share my screen and get started. And just by way of kind of setting the frame for this conversation, I'm trying to do something today that I haven't done before, which is bring punitive cities and cooperative cities together. And it's in terms of the theoretical work that needs to happen to do that, that is not necessarily what I'm offering today. I'm offering some of the empirical work that I've done, as well as some of the grounded kind of community engagement and organizing work that's ongoing in Chicago. So I will use Chicago as the case, noting that I am not a Chicagoan, so I've been here 6 years, but this is not unique. The things I'll talk about are not unique to Chicago, especially the punitive aspects. And so I start with this quote from Finley. Municipalism is distinguished by its insistence that the underlying problem with society is our disempowerment. Capitalism and the state not only cause extraordinary material suffering and inequality, they also rob us of the ability to play a meaningful role in our own lives and communities. And so while I fully agree with this, I'm also left pondering the role of the city. What is the role of the municipal in our lives and in transformative change, right? As a planner and as a professor of planning and policy, one would like to believe we have some agency even within the state, but as a resident of the US, I realize that role is somewhat limited, and I don't want to sound too cynical, but let me go forward. So just for those who are not as familiar with Chicago, Chicago is known and notorious for its residents' deep commitment to their areas, yeah? And typically people talk about they're from the north side. I mean, those who are just broadly defining. You're from the north side of Chicago, the south side or the west side, right? And so moving to Chicago, I didn't fully know what that meant. And although the map on the left is more divided by at least 7 different categories, as I say, the north side, I don't know if you can see the cursor, the north side, these 2 areas, as well as what's called central, that's all considered north. West and southwest is west, and southeast and far south is south. And that is important, and just kind of hold this throughout the presentation. On the right, what we see is the racial composition of the city and the population density, right? And so within those broad categories of north, south, and west, the city is also divided into these 77 community areas, largely kind of coterminous with neighborhoods, but not fully. And what we see on the right is the population density. On the north side, the pink is very dense. It's disproportionately white with some Latino. On the west side, it's disproportionate. Well, no, it's a mix of Black and some Latino, far fewer white. On the south side, it's overwhelmingly Black, although there's some pockets that are not Black, right? And so it's not even that you see a lot of mixing. It's that they're not Black. They're either white or Latino. Again, that's important. Just a few other contextual facts. And the population and the racialization of this city align with where we see investments, right? No surprise, this happens in pretty much every city. So the per capita kind of investment, if we use new building permits, we see far more in the middle, which is the loop, but the overall kind of layout of the city kind of maps onto where we're seeing investment, less investment and more investment, which is also aligned with the racial landscape and class, right? And then neighborhood hardship index, once again, high hardship or in areas that are disproportionately Black and Latinx, and low in areas that are disproportionately white. With that, what we've been seeing over the last 4 decades or so, has been an outmigration of population. So Chicago is one of the shrinking cities. And although we tend to think of Buffalo and Cleveland, much smaller cities, Chicago has been shrinking since its heyday. And although we have 2.7 million people, it's down from the peak around 1980 or so. And so what you're seeing in this is the kind of the outmigration or white flight, starting in 1960 through 1980. White population continued to decline in 90, 2000, but we're also seeing a decline of Black population, especially come to 2010, and it continues through 2020. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of residents. I think since 1990, it's been over 400,000 Black residents that have left. And this is important because it shifts both the spatial kind of composition in terms of where we're seeing density and where investment is, and it also shifts the political landscape, of course. And so this is just another kind of rendering of it that brings it to the contemporary moment. So the 2010 to 2020 population change, far left, loss of Black population, and there's slow growth of white, far more in terms of Latinx and Asian. So the landscape of this city is changing. And then this is just very quickly, like, where are people going? This is what kind of led me to think about the punitive cities, because people are not moving far. So this only shows Black and white movers, but people are not moving particularly far. If I showed this in a graph in terms of the areas that are receiving residents, the area that are receiving the most residents, especially Black residents, are within the state of Illinois, the suburbs, or a little further out, or neighboring states, such as Michigan, well, less so Michigan, but that would be, we have Wisconsin and Indiana. All right, and that is important because if you love your home, but you've decided it's time to go, I would think that you're going somewhere somewhat distant from where you are, right? You're going to start again. You're going to look for something very different. That's assuming you have full agency and choice in that mobility, right? The fact that residents are moving not far from Chicago, sometimes within the same county or neighboring states, suggests that there may be some reticence in terms of moving, but they have to get out of the city for one reason or another. So that led me to this punitive city research. In 2018, ProPublica Illinois and WBEZ, which is our NPR kind of affiliate or NPR syndicate, I don't know what they're called, did a brilliant journalistic expose, essentially, of tickets and the impact of tickets on Chicagoans. And it was brilliant in the research, and it was brilliant in the narratives that they were able to unearth, right? And speaking to people that moved to Indiana, that moved to Cook County, and asked why. And the debt burden was a major component, which became interesting. This was a couple of years after Ferguson and the Department of Justice report that came out that showed the disparate impact of fines, fees, and forfeitures on Black residents of Ferguson relative to their proportion in terms of population. So more and more cities started looking at this, yeah? A similar investigation happened in Chicago, but it was internal in terms of, it was the investigator, the Office of Investigator General, the city of Chicago, and they pointed to fines and fees as something that needed more attention. At the same time, the journalists are doing a brilliant job, and other kind of research institutes like Woodstock had started this research as well. What I found interesting in that is that on all of these stories, the stories in terms of the debt that was caused because there's a disparate impact of policing people on their bicycles on the South Side and getting tickets, snow removal, the myriad of ways in which people can accumulate tickets or violations, summonses, there's a racial pattern. But what I didn't see in the research was attention to the automated cameras, right? Which are everywhere. And they're far more, they give far more tickets than any officers could possibly, right? And so they're often excluded from these large studies because of the presumption that the automation somewhat neutralizes the racial effect. So that led me to think, I think we should look at some of these automated tickets. And just lastly, in terms of the stories, I was part of a conversation or part of a panel, which literally brought me to tears. I was trying to cover it up. I was like, but the participant, it wasn't Rachel, but it was a gentleman who worked for the city. He was a fireman. His car that was parked on a lot received numerous tickets. He thought he only had 5. It wasn't in his neighborhood, it was next to his aunt's home. And his aunt told him, you need to come and deal with these tickets. When he went down to the city to pay these 5 tickets that were sitting on his car, they learned he had 70 tickets received within 4 months, or 4 to 6 months, let's say, and they had accumulated more than $30,000 in debt. And because of Chicago's the various laws, the scoff laws, the anti-scoff laws in Chicago, he was about to lose his job. You cannot work for the city of Chicago if you owe the city money, nor can you drive Lyft or Uber or anything. So what they set up is a very rapid way to file for bankruptcy. Chicago has more residents that have filed for bankruptcy than any city or municipality in the country. and bankruptcy based on tickets, like that was the caveat. More residents that are filed for bankruptcy because of tickets, just let that like sink in, than any place. That to me suggests there's a punitive, this is a punitive city, yeah? Because if you can't pay the first summons, which is often, let's say $100, there are $200 fines as well, the next one in 30 days, it doubles. And it keeps accumulating, doesn't keep doubling, but it keeps accumulating, and there is no statute of limitations. So if you couldn't pay that first, that first summons, it's highly unlikely that you'll be able to pay thereafter. So that led me to start to explore specifically the cameras, because I think the other kinds of tickets had been brilliantly analyzed. So I got access to the data set from WBEZ and ProPublica, but the city eventually made it public as well. And I began analyzing the camera tickets. In terms of the descriptives that I found, you know, they look like a very clear racial pattern. The map looked very much like the maps I showed, and it seemed like ticketing was coterminous with the racial pattern of the city. But I knew one thing is that I was probably over my head and I'm missing a lot of things in that. And so I reached to my colleague, Nebiu Tillahun, who is a transportation planner. And so that first presentation that I did, it just so happened that the commissioner of transportation was in the audience. And she came up to me and offered me more data. She said, you know, would you like to go further into this? And which was surprising because I was very clear in terms of the racial disparity and the punitive nature of the city. And she was offering me and Nebiu, who wasn't there yet, access to more. So with that more, meaning 2014 to 2019 ticket level data with their addresses that could be geocoded, it was a huge data set that we eventually received. I think it was like 2019 or so. And we were able to ask these primary questions. And we were analyzing the equity and efficacy of Chicago's automated camera enforcement program, which is both red light and speeding. And we broke that down into these three questions. And just because of time, I'm not going to be able to go in depth into any of them. I'm going to show you just some of the things that we found. But I think the punchline and what's particularly important is the city's response to it. So we first started to look at the social and spatial distributional effects of the tickets for households. The economic effects, right? What's the economic, what I call an economic burden of ticketing? We know people who have to file for bankruptcy, but even those who are able to pay their tickets, what does that look like? How burdened are residents that are able to pay? And then Nebiu really delved into the safety profile of tickets. That's what transportation planners do, right? So this is not, I perhaps could have taken this out, but this just again shows the number of tickets were about 9 million tickets, but we really focused on 2016 to 2019 and on Chicago only, and those that could be geocoded. And once we excluded the institutions, we were really working with about 2.7 million tickets. When we look at the distribution, well, these maps are very similar to the maps that I showed originally, right? In terms of whatever they're showing, the patterns are similar. What you see along the lake or along, the lake is here, what you see along the far right side or the east of the city looks very different than what you see on the west side of the city and the south side, whatever we're mapping, which is actually quite profound. And here what we're mapping is the spatial patterns of tickets per household between 2016 and 2019, right? And so the darker areas are more tickets per household and the lighter areas are fewer, which also follow kind of the racial and income patterns of the city. So we did all that you would expect in terms of all the modeling, right? And what we kept coming up with that we couldn't explain is why is majority Black the strongest and most consistent predictor of tickets. While that, to me, initially, I thought, wow, this is great. This is going to get in the journal, and wow, we're saying something. But you realize right away you have to explain that, you know? You can't just put it out there. And we couldn't really come up with a good explanation initially. So although we received the data in 2019, it took us years. This report just came out, and there's some other explanations for why, to come up with a stronger argument as to both the racial effects. And there are many, many models I can show. I'm not going to go into them. I think what's important here is, one, just looking at majority Black, but also when we control for, or we factor in, so this is a kind of a standardized model estimate. So that means we can compare across these variables, right? They were all standardized. The variable, besides majority Black in terms of the number of tickets going up, the number of chain grocery stores, for instance, right? Those, and we use chain because those were typically the larger ones. The proximity to, or the number of grocery stores in a bounded area of, I think we use like 3 miles. As the numbers go up, the ticket numbers go down. So if you have to drive further to a grocery store, you tend to get more tickets, right? So we started to focus on the exposure, like what are the variables that would help us understand exposure to tickets? And what people always ask, it's like, well, there must be more cameras in Black and brown neighborhoods. And actually not exactly, right? And the full report is available. You can find the full report. It's not so much that there are more cameras if you just count them, but it's where they're strategically placed in Black and brown neighborhoods, and disproportionately in Black neighborhoods. They're proximate to freeways. The disproportionate number of cameras that are proximate to freeways, which give a disproportionate number of tickets, are in Black neighborhoods, right? And so people that are getting onto the freeway, and they may, and it's often turning right on red, which is not allowed, and well, it's allowed, but you have to come to a full stop. That infraction is the infraction that causes the largest number of tickets. From a safety perspective, that's a problem. You know, we don't want, we're arguing, you know, we don't want to suggest that people should be able to go through lights or speed in any way, but there are also levels of, or severity of harm, or severity of probable harm, are very different when you're turning right on red versus turning left, and so forth. This again is where the transportation planner he dug in deep. And so that was one kind of point that we could show the city, and they argued they didn't know, they didn't realize that this was happening. Yeah? And so when we started to look at the distribution of cameras again, camera tickets by track, what you're seeing here is both the distribution overall, number of tickets per household, but then on the right side, we're showing the tickets that were paid. And the proportion paid, the lighter hues are the lower proportion, and the darker hue, or the blue, is the greater share of tickets received that actually get paid. And it's not surprising, again, this pattern, this looks like everything else that we tend to map. And so I'm speeding through. So to think about the economic burden, we were trying to get at, well, how do we look at the burden in terms of as a share of income relative to the city and relative to the number of tickets people receive, right? Like, so some people would say, well, they got more tickets, so of course they're paying more. Well, so the plot on the left is essentially showing this. It's showing the fines and fees as a percent of income, and so what you're seeing is at least the dot well up above this somewhat outlier. 1.5% of aggregate income over 4 years is going toward tickets. And for in neighborhoods in which the population is majority Black, and we use 60% as majority, and you could use 80% in Chicago, and you get a comparable number of census tracts, because once you're at 60% Black, it's they're you can go to 80 and 90%. So what we're seeing again is there's a racial pattern, there's a class pattern, and there seems to be an argument for changing the punitive nature of ticketing and not jeopardizing the safety effects. But I haven't shown any of the safety effects yet. Or I actually don't think I'm going to, but I'll speak to it. The big takeaway for us in terms of the economic impact is when you separate the fines from the fees. The fine I defined as the infraction, the $100. So it's $100 speeding ticket, it's $100 red light ticket, and it doubles to $200 if it's not paid. Those are the fees, and it continues to aggregate additional penalties. Those are all fees. And the data set allows you to separate those, yeah? And so on the left, what you're seeing is the share of paid fines relative to the number of tickets that people receive. And so low-income neighborhoods, middle, upper, are about equal. Right, and that we could also kind of show kind of the racial pattern, which is quite comparable to low, middle, upper, but they're quite equal in terms of the median is about 1, which we would expect. But then when you go to the fees, it tells a different story, right? It tells a story that obviously people with more income accrue fewer fees. People that accrue more fees get into this loop that can end in bankruptcy, and before getting there, your car is towed. It's booted, then towed. It sits in the pound. If it sits there for X number of days, well, I think it's more than days. I think it's a few weeks. The pound has the right to turn your vehicle into scrap metal, and that scrap metal. The money they receive from turning your vehicle into scrap metal doesn't go toward your whatever the fee or fines that you owe. That whole cycle, right, suggests the punitive nature of ticketing. Yeah. So what do we say? And that was the shortest I've ever done that, because I think the full report is like 70 pages, so a very detailed analysis and suggestions. And so our overall recommendations to the city are broken down into the thinking about where the cameras are located, what we can do about the fines and fees, and how should we think about the safety profile and the safety impacts of these cameras, right? So you can absorb these, and I'm going to tell you that because the city gave us that data and they paid for some research assistance and so forth, they had more power than I understood when I first took this project on. And that then extended this because they didn't want us to speak about it for some time, and I'm not going to go down that road either. But once we were able to, and we presented this, they had a response because this hit the news. It was a big story. ProPublica covered it, others covered it, and the city had a response. And their response was that they were going to implement means-tested ticketing. They're going to put thresholds on maximums and so on and so forth. There was going to be some other mechanisms in place that would make it less burdensome especially for low-income people. Right, so that's a good thing. That gets at the contradiction of the city as the holder of these various policies and practices, and it also shows that these are a set of decisions that got made at some point. Perhaps the decisions that got made started in 2003 under Daley when the camera program was implemented, but they've been sustained since then. And so it takes planners, policy makers, others to push back and do that kind of work to say we could do this differently. And it also takes the media covering it and really then giving advocacy and organizers, the advocates and organizers the material so that they can make an argument. I was trying to look at my time, okay? So what does that have to do with cooperative cities? And I would say not a lot necessarily, and I'm still working through that theoretically. But I realized around the same time, so I think I started this study around 2017, and that was about the same time that I was working on the other study, that there were a set of cities out there that were somewhat exemplary, right? With my interest in worker-owned cooperatives, economic democracy, solidarity economy, a number of cities kept coming up. And if you're in Medford, you know, I imagine that your city is one of those cities in which you have kind of a robust and growing ecosystem. And so for this study, I was really just looking at the municipal support. What does that look like? How are cities? So this is essentially a top down. It's not with full understanding that the work is at the grassroots. But what is the role of the city in terms of supporting this? Because cities can create enabling environments or they can be a hindrance, right? And there's probably something in between that limit. But nevertheless, I was trying to identify that. Just because of time, I'll just go through it very, very quickly. And you know, again, being in Boston, you know that these various heterodox models of economic organizing are becoming more and more prolific, right? And worker-owned cooperatives are a bulwark against the economic instability and dislocation. And as De Philippis says, it's the purest form of economic democracy that we currently have. And so what I was trying to do is identify examples. So identify what is legible. And that becomes a metric that I use for identifying cities. What is legible in legislation, in transcripts from you know, council meetings, and other textual kind of through other textual analyses, I was able to identify cities, especially and focusing on cities that have more than 100,000 residents, that were doing something. And then once I identified 12 cities that were doing something, and those were the only 12 at the time I was doing this that I could find, I started to then disaggregate that and try to understand what they were doing. And so, how are cities creating enabling environments? What constitutes a cooperative city? You know, the term that I was using. What various approaches are cities adopting, and what are the limitations of municipal involvement? And that is where my research currently is. What are the limitations? And because the cooperative movement is a grassroots movement, so the work on the solidarity economy movement is very much endogenous, coming from a community. I'm not going to go through all that. So I think it's easier to just show what I found. Where is that slide? Here. Okay. So what I did was, once I identified the 12 cities, Cleveland, Richmond, Virginia, Richmond, California, Rochester, Austin, Berkeley, Boston, Oakland, Philadelphia, Madison, Minneapolis, and New York, I realized, okay, they're not all the same in what they're doing. Some are working from a top-down perspective, right, in terms of initiating and starting some cooperatives. And there wasn't a large number of cooperatives that pre-existed in the neighborhoods, right? And I call those developer cities. Then there are a set of endorser cities that at that time, I would say Boston is there, and it may still be, because again, this is what the city is doing, not all the wonderful work happening on the ground and the ecosystem and the Center for Economic Democracy and Ujima and all these wonderful projects and the Solidarity Economy Initiative, all these things that are not led by city, right, or necessarily even supported by, although philanthropy supports. So there are a set of cities that have a culture of cooperatives, but they're not they're supporting them, you know, kind of middling. And I call those endorser cities. And then there are a set of cultivator cities. And I would argue that some of these endorser cities are moving toward cultivator cities, and we also have more cities doing things. And those cities there's a culture of cooperatives, and the city is doing stuff that's quite legible. Most notably in New York, it was a lot of money. They were putting into building an infrastructure, the ecosystem that's necessary. They were investing in that, right? And so these are just some of the things that they were doing. And why is all of this important? This was important just for my learning. It was important, I think, as a research project, but I learned only after it was published that it was important as a way for cities to look at other cities and say, oh, okay, well, they're doing this over there. Why? And literally, I had municipal leaders ask me, well, why aren't we on the list? And that's what happened in Chicago. Why aren't we on the list? And I said, well, because you're not doing anything. I mean, I don't know how else to say it, right? And I'm kind of blunt. So that's how it came out. But I did the same thing in Cincinnati, and Cincinnati has a wonderful ecosystem, but the city wasn't supporting it. Same thing in Baltimore. And so this became a tool for cities to say, okay, where can I plug in? How do I want to plug in? You know, cities are kind of competitive in that way, I've learned. And there are a lot of ways they can plug in. And so the biggest, I guess, announcement that, and I think one of the things that I'm very proud of and supportive of is this community wealth building initiative that the city is launching. The money was adopted. I mean, it was inserted into the budget, which the mayor adopted and the city council sanctioned. So $15 million going into community wealth building initiatives. Given the broad kind of $168 million for community development, 15 million is not a lot, but it is a lot for those of us doing this work. It's a huge amount, is a lump sum. Over 5 years, New York put $15 million or so, but this lump sum, but it had, you know, at the same time, we haven't seen it yet. It's been allocated. I mean, yeah, it's been allocated, but we haven't seen it. And this is important because the Office of Equity and Racial Justice, we have a champion. We have a champion that came to us and you know, both with not just me, but you know, what I was able to bring is some of the evidence, the number of community orgs doing work on the ground. My colleague and comrade at the UIC Law School, Renee Hatcher, who's doing this work in terms of from a legal perspective and helping cooperatives. And she brought us all together and said, okay, what can the city do? And initially, the project was going to be framed as supporting Black and Latinx businesses. And we were like, no. We have that in Chicago, and just supporting Black and Latinx businesses does not mitigate it doesn't ensure that we're going to have a more equitable environment, right? And so we inserted language around democratically organized, community-controlled enterprises. And that is important because we tried to get them to adopt solidarity economy, and they were like, no. We tried to get them to just focus on worker cooperatives, and they weren't as supportive in terms of the language. They didn't think it would get passed. But this initiative is very much for that. So it's both worker-owned cooperatives and housing, you know, and so this is all from the city. I just cut from one of the PowerPoints that they did. I mean, presentations. So it's still being launched, but the idea is to essentially use these resources over 2 or 3 years to show proof of concept, right? And the power of strong community wealth building ecosystems. And they want to fund new and existing ecosystem organizations. And so that's the legal, advocacy, financial, business development, and education. They want to fund worker-owned cooperatives, but also, like, I think a housing cooperative, and just, you know, see what that does essentially. So in that regard, it's a way I'm showing this because, especially, I don't know who's in the audience, but for those of us that are, you know, see ourselves as scholar activists or you know, scholar advocates, it becomes sometimes disheartening that we do this research and it makes it into a journal, which is great. If anybody out there are editors of journals, that is a goal, to make it into journals. But for me, more importantly, is to have some utility, right? To actually change things that we're working on in community, whether I'm directly involved or not. And so, but because I'm telling this story, it's a story in which I am involved, but it still would be quite satisfying to see the way in which research can be used to both redress some of the punitive policies and practices and support the cooperative or the solidarity practices that are kind of, or help to germinate those in the city. I think I'm probably out of time. I don't know if somebody wants to give me a nod on that, because I can stop here, or I think this is actually the last slide. And this is a slide that is not necessarily connected to the others, but these are community orgs. Oh, this is somewhat of an ecosystem of organizations described as paths, partners in abolition, transformation, healing, and solidarity. And we received a grant from a local foundation for movement building. It was $500,000 for movement building, which it was kind of profound. And they really wanted it. So the 11 of us had not worked together in this formation before. We knew there were connections in different ways, but we came together to write this grant. Yeah. And so I was part of Resist, Reimagine, Rebuild, and we wrote the grant, we got the grant. And what they said in terms of why they liked our proposal is we were very explicit in building a framework that focuses on fight and build and heal, right? And it's not just the groups that are doing the base building, Black Lives Matter and EAT and what other, Chicago Torture Justice, nor is it just kind of the solidarity economy or these three, Chai Fresh, Upside Down, Solidarity Chicago, this other one, that whatever, and Cola Nut, nor is it some of the healers that are involved, it's all of them. And so we sat together for a year, kind of trying to figure out what we were going to do. And we have some really interesting projects that we're now launching that are going to organize these committees. We're soon to launch this fellowship that we've been working on. It's BASE Fellowship, which is Black Abolitionist Solidarity Economy Fellowship. We're doing political education and popular education. And then we have this, we're doing a development project that we're trying to start. Whew. So that is it. I'm pretty certain that must be yes, thank you. Yeah, so thank you for your time. I'm going to stop sharing and, oops, no, that's not it.
Well, Stacey, thank you so much for an incredible presentation. I mean, your passion for the work comes through, and rest assured that there are a lot of scholar activists like you. We wouldn't be doing what we're doing. We wouldn't be doing it well if we weren't scholar activists. And we've got quite a few questions and points. I'm going to just start with a question from my colleague Pen Lowe here at UEP. Stacey, incredible work all round. I'm curious about how the abolition aspect of the solidarity economy movement landscape in Chicago might be connected to the punitive city research.
Oh, that's interesting. So perhaps not in that particular study, although there's an org here, what is it, something racial equity, and they do research. And so there are a number of orgs that are interested in using the data, using not the data, the findings, right, to make some of their arguments and do some of the advocacy. But I think there are other ways in which they define punitive, and they then reach out to see how, as a researcher, how I might be able to offer either data or either data that's been refined and offer descriptive statistics or something. So I think to your point, Penn, there's great opportunity, I think. And so abolition as a concept, I think is more evident in terms of the way we define abolition. It's doing away with oppressive institutions and building. So, with abolition, you have to build. It's not just abolish, it's building and creating a framework for building institutions that are supportive of and come from the community, address community needs. So if this work, Punitive Cities, can at least begin to redress some of the harm, right? That it's just a reform. It's not, I wouldn't even say it's a non-reformist reform. It's a reform, to what the city is offering. We need to do away with the punitive nature. I mean, we have studies outside of the US that show you don't have to monetize tickets, right? So there are other alternatives. The cities are not, some cities are going that route. I should say that, because like in Jersey, they are doing away with all cameras. Texas did with all cameras. The politics of it is different, but nevertheless, the hyper surveillance that then limits the way in which people are surveilled. So I think there's a lot of possibility for overlap, especially in the theoretical.
And Stacey, great answer. And one thing I'm thinking of is, I was looking at bike citation data from Chicago, from various cities, and it follows the same pattern as the traffic citation. And I'm sure you're aware of Reed's work with equiticity. I'm on
I work with him.
Yeah. You're really doing some great work there. We've got a question here from Miranda Sheffield, who works with the National Center for Youth Law as the Debt-Free Justice Campaign Coordinator to abolish all juvenile court fees and fines for youth across all 50 states. She'd love to know how many, whoops, the question just disappeared, how she can build the solidarity economy into other similar campaigns. And Megan, Miranda, if you're around, if I didn't quite get the spirit of your question, please speak up and speak to Stacey.
Yeah, perhaps I'm not. Are you referring to, because they're separate? Although I spoke quickly, and it's not so much that the solidarity economy is built into the punitive or the fines and fees project. I think there's an ethos that cuts across, at least for me, right? Why do I take on certain things, or why am I interested? But I think to your point in the work that you're doing, you and many other advocates, I met with, who reached out? The Center for Fines and Fees Reform, Fine and Fee Justice Center, that's what it was, Fine and Fee Justice Center, right? To talk about what's possible. But maybe you can clarify that question for me in terms, so I can better articulate intersections or possibilities. I'm not.
Yes. Thank you, Stacey, so much for the presentation. It's been really helpful. I work with the National Center of Youth Law, and our campaign is focused on abolishing all fees and fines related to court and municipal courts for young folks, or particularly Black and Brown folks who are hit the hardest with this. And while I feel it's important to get rid of this, I also feel like what you did, which was really lovely, is that you talked about how punitive these cities were, but you also said that there's a way when we're addressing policy and when we're putting out a demand about how this can look alternatively. It was talking about cooperatives. It was talking about, the city putting aside $15 million for wealth building. So like, I would love to know, like, while we're trying to, like you said, get rid of this, like, what's the way of how we can like utilize more tools and more things to like say it's much bigger than just the fines and fees. It's actually connected to like building, a less of a extractive economy, more of a solidarity economy.
I see. Yeah, and I wish there was almost a causal relationship there. I mean, as I said, I presented them because they're both projects I work on, but it's presenting them almost as contradiction, right? They reside in different parts of the city, if we're just saying with, and so the demands for the Department of Transportation, and the mayor's office. I guess they come together in the mayor's office because the mayor's office was on that committee as well. And they're doing these reforms, which I think they could push further, but nevertheless, is different than the folks I work with at the Office of Economic and Racial Justice, although that office is a mayor's office. It sits within the mayor's office as well. And there, the money, the reason we're able to, it was just really the moment in terms of the money is out there. And I think all of us are in places in which there's money more so than before. And getting cities to see possibility, to see that if we keep investing in the same things, we'll get the same outcome. I know that sounds quite banal, but I said that, like we've had been investing, and I'm not saying disinvest like in Latinx businesses, but we do have to think differently about what that can look like, what the possibilities are. So I think working with youth, and we're trying to start a youth program with the organizers this summer. That's the development project. I think it's painting that picture. I mean, you can ask Penla. It's really hard for folks to imagine alternatives at times. So you have to be very explicit in what is possible, and that's why you then point to other examples. There are places this is working. This is not a kind of a utopian idea. This is grounded in place and practice, and there's no reason, at least. And one thing I can say, they like the idea of pilot programs, right? So it's not a full line item yet, but we're piloting something. So using that language of piloting a program, I think, it tends to work better.
Okay, Stacey, I'm going to have the prerogative of the organizer to ask you, I think, what might be the final question. When you're talking about, well, there's two questions, but I've got so many questions. I mean, is there a continuum from punitive city to cooperative city? Do you see it as a continuum? And can the cooperative city grow out of, what is a punitive city? But the more fundamental question I want to ask you is, in a recent piece, I said, urban planning is the spatial toolkit of white supremacy, and we can do something about it. You fell short in the punitive section of your talk. You described the phenomenon, but somebody made a call that this should be the way it is. Can you speak a little bit to how this, I mean, both the automation and the site and the person given citations, I mean, that's a policy decision.
Yes. Can
you speak to it and don't hold back?
No, okay. And so I thought I mentioned it. So the first part is a continuum. I think it's more of a duality. I think every city, with the myriad of summonses and fees and regulatory kind of apparatus, they tend to be punitive, and so there might be a gradient of punitive. Not all cities have kind of elements of the cooperative at the city level, although I think it happens at the grassroots. But I would love to kind of speak and talk and sit with you longer and think about what that continuum could look like, right? But I imagine cities can be in both places. But to your other question, which I love, I tried to address it by saying, yes, this started, located in 2004 when when the ordinance was passed to implement red light cameras. And it was immediately outsourced to a private vendor who maintains and supposedly does these studies and so forth. Where every camera is located is a decision, absolutely. And I started by showing the racial landscape of Chicago, which is also a set of decisions in terms of where different groups live. And I'm going to be explicit in saying one of the, I think, most ironic components of that, the punitive cities, or at least the camera study, is the effect of the highway, right? The highway is particularly pernicious in Black neighborhoods because that's where cameras are located right at the on-ramp. Well, that highway was particularly pernicious in terms of dividing these neighborhoods. So it's almost this double threat, I can't think of the word, but I think you get what I'm saying. Meaning, it's this highway is divided the neighborhood. It was part of the urban renewal reconstruction. It's also the line of demarcation, essentially, in terms of where investment gets located and disinvestment on the other side. And on a daily, it's ticketing residents more than other cameras in other parts of the city, right? So the cameras that are proximate to the highways. And so if that is not, to me, that is both a structural issue of structural racism, but it's in some ways, it's an institutional racism in that sense that it could be easily mitigated, right? The structure and the logic that makes this okay again and again through what now are 3 mayoral administrations since they were first implemented, that's structural racism. The fact that it doesn't matter that we have a Black mayor. It's the unquestioning practice of policymakers, planners, elected officials to reproduce these outcomes that are just woefully inequitable. And yet we have people in offices, in both the bureaucrats and administrators, that it doesn't take a lot to think about some of the data. It's very transparent. And so the fact that you're not even using all the data that you're collecting, all of this data-driven governance. Yeah, but what's the point of having data-driven governance if we're only reproducing the same thing? And that's why the cameras become interesting. And I didn't get into the theory of it because it's at this intersection of folks that are doing road safety or safety, the transportation folks, and the folks that are advocating for criminal justice reform, and the woman that just spoke in terms of the punitive nature of fines and fees is highly racialized. And this automation, the reason automated cameras were left out of so many studies, as I said, there's a presumption that they must be fair because you have full agency to drive. And if you broke the law, you have to pay. Well, it's not that simple. Not only is there a question of exposure, which is a decision that bureaucrats made in terms of where cameras are located, it's a question of, when you look at the data, you realize some people have to drive more because if you look at the infrastructure, there is no public transit or very limited public transit. There's no train line in many of the south side. We could go on and on in terms of the ways in which the Black and brown communities in Chicago are punished again and again and again. It's hard to find whether we talk about health and public health and it doesn't matter the issue. That's why I kept saying, look at the map. It doesn't matter the variable that you map. You get the same pattern. That's structural racism. It doesn't matter if I'm talking about health effects, ticket effects, transportation. It doesn't matter. And I say that quite emphatically because it's mind-boggling. And so I studied sociology as well as urban planning. And you read about the city and you read about the urban ecologists and so forth, and the concentric circles and so many studies, especially because I did neighborhood change, are focused on Chicago. And back in the day, it was Julius Wilson and others. And then when I moved here, I was like, oh my goodness, it feels like 1920s in many ways in terms of the socio-spatial dynamic.
Stacey, we could talk forever.
Yeah, I know, sorry.
But no, thank you for a really, really fantastic talk. You hit on so many of the interest areas of our faculty and students, and you did it in an engaging and passionate way. Thank you so much. Can we give a warm UEP Cities at Tufts thank you to Stacey?
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. And on March the 30th, 3 weeks, we will have Tamika Butler talking about transportation inequities. What's data got to do with it? From Cities at Tufts and UEP, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in a few weeks. Stay safe. Thank you.